Get started now. I'm Carl Silverstein with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy and want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar about conservation and climate change. This is a really kind of a crucial topic that I think so many of us feel kind of a climate dread and a powerlessness to deal with these overwhelming existential problems the planet faces around climate change. But we hope today to share some things with you about the work of land trusts and conservation that'll kind of help you feel more optimistic and empowered around these issues. We're thrilled to have two panelists today who have devoted a lot of attention to climate change and mitigating it. First, I want to recognize Nikki Robinson, who's the North Carolina project manager with the Wildlands Network. And Wildlands Network has been one of our key partners. Nikki works with land trusts and other agencies to solve complex issues and problems, look for solutions that benefit nature by working collaboratively and with community support. Nikki has a master's in plant biology from University of Vermont and a BS in science and environment from Clemson. Angela works with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy in our medial relations and online and printed communications. Angela joined the staff with SAHC in 2010. She holds a master's in geography and planning from Appalachian State and a BA in public relations from University of South Carolina. So thank you so much, Angela and Nikki, for making this presentation today. Angela is going to start us off with a look at how land trusts work generally relate to climate resilience.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks, Nikki, for being here. So kind of big overview, conservation and climate change. Our work for decades has been in the realm of looking to the future and looking at how things change over long periods of time. And so all of that feeds into resilience. If you're familiar with discussions about climate change, you're probably familiar with the term resilience. But for those who aren't, we're looking specifically at the ways that we adapt to and also lessen the impacts from climate change. So what are some of the ways that conservation work directly impacts climate change or mitigate? Thanks, Pauline, sorry about that. So looking at the ways that we can mitigate changes from climate change. So preserving land for clean water. So conservation of land around headwaters is one of the places that we focus on. So conserving land in riparian areas, those are the lands that surround streams and surround bodies of water, help protect sources of clean water, which feed into our drinking water supplies, which as things change, we know that having fresh, clean water is critical for drinking water for people as well as for animals, preserving the ecosystems, the aquatic ecosystems, but preserving the land around these streams and preserving land in general, large amounts of land that can filter rainwater also helps protect those aquifers, the groundwater sources of drinking water for those folks who have wells. And also preserving land and keeping development out of these riparian areas can lessen the impacts from floods, because we know as we increase impervious surfaces, that increases the damage from flooding events. And so the more land that we preserve around our riparian, our streams and our rivers and waterways, the better we're able to respond to and to prevent more damage from flooding events. And stream shade also, so when we have trees, when we have plants, when we have things that are growing around our streams, they're able to shade the stream and keep the temperatures down. So as temperatures rise, it becomes more and more important for us to try to keep that stream shade so that the temperatures in the water bodies aren't rising to a degree that they're killing off the organisms. For example, brook trout need really cold, clean stream waters. And so making sure that we preserve those high elevation headwaters is more and more important. So we have water and soil, two of the components that are critical for our survival and for the survival of animals and plants. So prime soils is one of the things when we talk about working farmlands and preserving farmlands and agricultural lands. A lot of times we really kind of focus in on preserving those prime soils, which are soils of national importance or local or statewide importance even, because not all soils are created equally. So prime soils and soils of national statewide importance are soils that are particularly fertile, they're particularly rich in nutrients, they form over a long period of time with lots of different flooding events and sediment deposits. And they also generally occur in areas that are kind of flattish, that are maybe easy to develop with access to roads. And so if we develop on these prime soils, not only is the agricultural land lost to us now, but the ability to farm in the future in these areas is also lost. So once these prime soils are gone, they're very difficult to replace. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, long supply chains means that little fluctuations in the process of supply and demand can create critical shortages down the road. So one of the things we talk about, and we partner with our local family farms when they come to us and they are looking for a way to preserve their farmland where they've been able to farm for generations, preserving these local farms for the production of local food, not just now, but for generations in the future, is critical for securing our ability to have healthy local food. It's important for our food security, for economic stability, and for preventing, if we can produce more of our food locally, then not having to have those long supply lines would help in different ways to reduce impacts from climate change. And one of the most obvious ways that conservation feeds into climate resilience and reduces impacts from climate change is that we're preserving forests. A lot of what we're looking at are older growth, intact forests that can absorb and store carbon. So preventing these forests from being cut down, from being developed, prevents that carbon from being added to the atmosphere. So protecting forests in these biologically rich areas is one of the ways that we concentrate and have concentrated our conservation efforts for years. And we talk about focusing on the ecological stage. So rather than drilling down into, we're going to talk about this one species in this one area where it's living right now, we're looking at the big picture. We're looking decades down the road. We're looking at how species are going to move, how they're going to migrate, how changes are going to impact different populations. So we're really looking at the stage of biodiversity. And in the Southern Appalachians in particular, the wealth of plant and animal species that we have results from all of our diverse ecosystems. And these have been created by forces at play over the ages in these ancient mountains. So we've got conifer forests and spruce pine forests on the mountaintops at high elevations. We've got grassy open shrub balls. We've got rocky outcrops. We've got different little pockets of these microclimates and ecosystems throughout the mountains. So all of these differences, the aspect, which way the terrain is facing, the geology, the hydrology, topography, elevation, all through the Southern Appalachians creates these different places for plants and animals to live. We have little pockets of populations, but it also creates different places for them to move. So as the climate changes, as we see differences occurring, if they're able to move to a higher elevation on the mountain or to a different aspect on the other side of the mountain, this is going to increase their resiliency, their ability to adapt to climate change. So one of the things that makes that ability to move and to adapt important is that we're protecting large contiguous areas of land. So if we're protecting places that are fractured, that are separate in small little pockets here and there spread throughout the mountains, it's not going to be effective. What we really do is look at contiguous forest land. We look at networks. How can we link, a large national park land to another place that's been protected, and how can we kind of build out these areas so that wildlife, plants, even animals, fish and birds can take advantages of these different interconnected areas, and that they can move without coming into contact with people in such a way that there's a disturbance and that the animals aren't able to survive. So these protected landscapes are going to enable plant and animal life to be more resilient, to better respond and survive the impacts of climate change, and to protect like buffers along the national forest land and our national park land. And this is a graph GIF that was produced by the Nature Conservancy in a mapping project. So you see how amphibians, birds, and mammals are projected to move. So this is kind of showing where they are now to like where they're projected to move as the climate changes. And you can see how this chain through the Appalachian Mountains becomes such a critical area. There's so many species that are projected to move and that do already use this area. This is a rich biodiverse highway for animal migration and movement. And wildlife corridors. So what we mean by wildlife corridors are those areas that are interconnected for plants and animals to move. And SAHC, Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, works with willing landowners, with state and federal agencies and other organizations to protect land and water resources in these wildlife corridors. One of our partners in the landscape is the Wildlands Network. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Nikki to talk more about wildland corridors.
Thank you, Angela. That was a great overview of your land conservation efforts in Western North Carolina. I'm so happy to be here and talking with you all about land conservation and wildlife behavior. It's one of my favorite things. And so today I'd like to talk about ways that Wildlands Network and Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy are working together on mitigating climate change in our region. And so I'm going to also share my screen and see here. Oops. And hopefully I will be able to start it from beginning. Great. So like I said, I'm from the Wildlands Network. And if you've never heard of our organization before, it's a continental-wide movement to protect nature across the landscape with the ideas of these wildways. And so you can see here, hopefully that's not, yeah. You can see here, we have these identified wildways that we sort of strategize around with our efforts to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that all diversity can thrive. And so you can see we have a Pacific Wildway, a Western Wildway that cuts up through the continent, and then an Eastern Wildway. And today we're going to talk about our efforts in the Eastern Wildway, specifically in North Carolina. But I thought I would show you this sort of broad picture so that you can understand sort of like this very, very large landscape scale that we're looking at in order to protect our biodiversity. So we partner with land trusts and other agencies to focus on projects that help protect our local ecosystems, advance our policy efforts for the good of the environment, and transforming our transportation networks, which I'm going to talk more in depth about today, and building community. And you'll see some of the ways that we've done that through these projects. So here is a more zoomed in approach of that Eastern Wildway graph that I showed you before. And you can see we have developed this core and corridor modeling up the East Coast for the Eastern Wildway. And so looking at North Carolina specifically, we have identified habitat cores, which are in the dark green, the connectivity corridors in sort of the lighter mustard yellow. And then orange is protected land already in North Carolina. So a couple of terms I want to introduce you to, if you don't know already, the term core, corridor, and then crossing. And those are three different things. The cores are big chunks of protected land, intact habitat for animals to move through. So they have plenty of resources, they have shelter, food, the ability to find mates, and genetic diversity. So the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is a great example of a habitat core. And then we've identified corridors, which will connect cores so that there is a sharing of resources, there's a sharing of genetic flow. And then a crossing is something that helps corridors connect with our other corridors and cores. So a crossing would be like a specific a road crossing. So sometimes we have cores and corridors that are intersected with busy roads. And the one I'm going to talk about specifically today is Interstate 40, which is kind of all near us, especially for those of you in Asheville. And it's a corridor that we've been looking at for a while, and we're trying to identify ways to create crossings along Interstate 40 for animals to move through, especially as they're traveling northward. And so just to kind of recap why crossings are important. Well, they're one of the greatest barriers to wildlife movement in North America. We have so many roads, and animals have these really natural migration patterns that they've been using by instinct for way before our roads were put in. So they don't know necessarily to avoid these roads. So there's a large wildlife vehicle collision situation that we need to address as a continent. So about 1 to 2 million large animals are hit every year. And it's a wildlife and a human problem. It's an economics problem. It's a cultural problem. And specifically here through Interstate 40, where we have Great Smoky Mountain National Park to the west, and Pisgah National Forest sort of cutting up along the northeastern side of the park, there's over 26,000 cars that pass through that 28 stretch of highway every day. So it's creating this huge fragment, and animals cannot safely get across and use the land effectively. So I'm sure you've heard of the idea of wildlife crossings before, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about a partnership that's actually making this happen in this area. It's called the Safe Passage Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Crossing Project. There are lots of partners involved. We have 20 partners. Over 100 people are dedicating their time, their technical assistance, and with coming up with ways to solve this issue. Oops, I think I skipped it. No, I didn't. Okay. There's 3 main animals that we're looking at with this study. We have black bear, which I know all of you are very familiar with in the Asheville area. Elk, because the elk were reintroduced in the Smokies in 2001, and now we have about 200 elk using the area. And then white-tailed deer, which is probably the most frequent wildlife vehicle collision situation that we have. And as we all know, the black bear population is increasing in Western North Carolina. And there's actually a black bear sanctuary along Interstate 40. So these bears are really using this corridor to find food and shelter and mates. And so I-40 has become really a terrible death zones, for lack of a better term, because they're getting hit so much. And just to like put it into a monetary perspective, costs about $6,000 to damages if you hit a white-tailed deer with your car. Hitting an elk, I mean, those animals are, 1,200 pounds. It can be up to $17,000 in damages. So something that we definitely need to avoid. So you've probably already seen this. This is a viral video, but I know it'll keep you on your toes as you watch. Not a situation that we want happening on I40. That mama black bear is just taking it right across the interstate during a really busy time, and those little cubs are following her, and they're going to learn that that is the way that they're supposed to get to the other side of the road. And fortunately, they got really lucky there, but that's not always the case. So what we're doing with this partnership, this coalition of all these partners, is that we're trying to figure out how animals are successfully and unsuccessfully crossing through this I40 area as they use this habitat corridor. So if you can see the pictures on the left side of the screen here, we have an elk going under an underpass with underneath the interstate, a black bear using a culvert. And then here, I want to show you this great video of a bobcat using this culvert. So they are using these structures. And so what we've done is we've put cameras out to identify where and who and how they're using these structures. So I love this one so much. This is a mama bobcat showing her kitten the way through the culvert. We'll watch it. And so now the kitten is learning how to get through the culvert. So in some places, these structures are really helpful for animals. In some places, the animals are not interested in using these structures that exist. So the bear, you can see here, strolling along, takes that cut up the hill instead of passing underneath an underpass. And it actually went up to cross the interstate on the interstate level. So did not feel comfortable going through the culvert. And then this one over here, you can see the bear takes just a complete 180, like not having it. I'm not going towards that interstate. So it's really creating this barrier effect. Whereas one situation will have an opportunity for a wildlife vehicle collision, and then the other one, we're creating this barrier effect. So neither one of these situations are good for our black bears. So like I said, we're taking these, we're doing these really in-depth research camera studies along with some elk GPS collar monitoring and roadkill data surveys to figure out where animals are successfully crossing and where they're not. And then like, how can we make it more successful? So there are lots of structures, a lot of infrastructure remodeling techniques that we can do that the animals will use, which will help them become much more successful in crossing. So I'll show you this video. These are otters, and they're using a culvert, a box culvert under the interstate. So the idea here with these smaller mammals, we're focusing on, like I said, the black bear, the white-tailed deer, the elk, because these are like the big public safety issues that we can work with our Department of Transportation on. Because public safety is such a huge, what is the mission of the DOT? So if we can mitigate these larger animal vehicle collisions, we can take that first step And then in time, start to introduce ideas of creating opportunities for smaller mammal connectivity. And then the hope is to focus on more aquatic connectivity challenges to kind of finish the whole picture with ecosystem connectivity. So there are a lot of ways that Wildlands Network can partner with organizations that are thinking about land conservation, prioritization, and restoration and things like that. So I just want to go over a couple of really, successful things that we've done in the past that that can emphasize that. And this one being this research component. We have scientists that are experts in the field of road ecology, which is a great new type of ology that studies animal behavior in response to roads and busy highways. We can also help land trusts and other organizations with sort of prioritizing their conservation efforts by looking at models like core and corridor connectivity and sort of mapping that out. And then that data can be used to do more research, and it can also inspire education efforts. And we work with universities and schools to address those research needs. For planning, land trusts a lot of times are looking to protect land on both sides of interstates and highways. So if you think about it, if we put in all of this effort to put in crossings at really high priority corridors, we may have protected land on one side of the road and then a way for animals to cross safely. But then it's super important to have land on the other side of the road protected so they don't just get funneled into a strip mall parking lot or a high density development area or something like that. So we want to be really intentional with how we can protect lands on both sides of the highways to sort of fulfill this corridor concept that we talked about earlier. And it can also help planning with minimizing encounters with wildlife and people. For instance, you don't want to put a campground right through a really popular black bear corridor. We can plan for that by using all of these camera traps and all of this data to try to minimize and not introduce a whole lot of wildlife and people conflicts. And in terms of outreach and education, I think people really love to learn and hear about projects that have wildlife conservation impact. And so one of the ways that we can support that is by providing maps of connectivity, our wildlife photos, like just the camera trap images are so captivating to people that once you see, an image of an animal in the wild, people are always tuned in and want to see more. And then a lot of our data can also be used to further grant requests and fundraising efforts for these conservation organizations. So I put this map up here, and for all you SAHC folks, this property should look pretty familiar with your sort of new latest acquisition of Chestnut Mountain in Canton. And so I wanted to point out here that we have Wildlands Network has cameras out on I40 monitoring wildlife movement in that area. So we've moved away from the Pigeon River Gorge, but just down I40 a little bit further. But I thought this would be another good model to show you about how land trusts and our organizations can partner together. So here you see, here's an aerial shot of I40, and you can see the Pigeon River and just like how steep the topography is and how wide that interstate is. And this isn't even I40 in, it's most congested. I know a lot of you have probably been on that interstate before when it's been super congested. It can look a lot worse than that. So the chances of wildlife and with wildlife getting across this road safely is really difficult, and the odds are not good. So by really targeting where these animals naturally want to cross, and places where we can take the opportunities and advantages of the local DOT projects, we can really sort of put together a really compelling view of how we can help animals expand their territory. So just here on I40 right now, there are 5 bridges that are up for replacement by the Department of Transportation. So we're working really closely with them as they go in and start to retrofit these bridges and culverts that need to be replaced. They'll have all this data from our camera trap studies and our recommendations from our scientists to say, here, okay, well, while you go in and replace this bridge, let's put up some fencing, and let's replace this box culvert so it's a little bit higher, so that animals will feel more comfortable passing through them. And of course, all animals have a different idea of what they like to use as far as crossings go. So some animals, like you saw in that culvert, they're fine to walk through those metal culverts, but a lot of them will not. Like any hoofed animal will not want to walk through a culvert, just because of the corrugated piping is not easy to walk on with their hooves. So we have to think about that. Elk will not use that. If you've ever driven on I40, you know that there's a land bridge over the double tunnel. Well, elk don't really like to cross over that land bridge. I don't know if it's something about the topography or what, but they're the one species that was in our 3 focus species that they didn't like the land bridge. So there's just a lot of factors in play here. And the more we know about the behavior of these species, the better we can plan for where they're most likely to cross. And hopefully one day our Pigeon River Gorge will look something a little bit more like this. And so I'm sure you've all probably seen some of the efforts in Canada at Banff National Park to put in these really wonderful, grandiose wildlife overpasses. And that's becoming more of a thing here in the US, especially out west, when we have sort of a greater abundance of large mammals and more public land. There are places where these wildlife overpasses are going in, and they're really, really effective. So I think it said on that earlier slide, they have a 97% chance of reducing wildlife vehicle collisions that are not only bad for wildlife, but very dangerous for humans as well. So I encourage you to learn more about these projects happening in our neck of the woods. There's a lot coming with in terms of bridge replacement projects and camera trap research. And I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have them. I will say, if you're listening today and SAHC is not your local land trust, maybe you are in a different region, I encourage you to contact your local land trust and ask them what their wildlife connectivity priorities are, and if they have any goals. And if so, do you think any of this information would be interesting to them or valid? If so, please put us in touch. I'd be happy to talk with other land trust partners. And hopefully this is a model that we can replicate in other places of the state. So let's see here. I'll stop sharing my screen. I think we were supposed to leave some time for questions, but I'm happy to turn it over to anyone else if they have anything else to say.
Thanks so much, Nikki. That was a wonderful presentation, and we appreciate what Wildlands Network is doing with SAHC right now. And thank you to Angela. We want to invite anybody who has questions to put those either in the chat or the Q&A, and we're happy to try to answer those as they come up. And it looks like there's a couple of questions that folks have asked, and Mark is asking where the land bridge is that exists over I40. If maybe you could share a little perspective on that.
I wish I had the mile marker memorized. I don't. If you're driving on I40 west towards Tennessee, the land bridge is just a couple of miles before you hit that Tennessee border.
Is there a tunnel through the mountain along the roadway where you're driving through a tunnel where the mountainside kind of is above the roadway?
Exactly. So they put in this double tunnel. So you know, it's two separate tunnels, traffic going both ways. And the land actually goes right over the interstate and then drops really dramatically into the Pigeon River. And that was put in not really with wildlife movement like at the core of the idea, but we see black bear, we see white-tailed deer, we see a lot of smaller mammals. They're just naturally using that double tunnel as a land bridge. So sort of a natural way for them to go that they've figured out to get over.
If you drive the highway and you look for that, you can definitely tell when you're at that point. So James has asked what are the popular theories about why elk don't want to use the land bridges?
Well, that is something that our scientists are looking at right now. We had actually 13 elk with GPS collars, and we tracked their movement. We've been tracking their movement for 2 years. And most of the elk are actually not crossing the interstate at all. The interstate is creating a barrier effect for them. So they're getting to the interstate and they're turning around and they're going back to the park. There is one example that I can tell you about a mother with, she crosses the interstate underneath the highway and calves on the other side, and then we'll bring her calf back over. So she has figured it out, and she's done it quite a few times successfully. The other time that an elk that I know of crossed the interstate, it was a bull elk. It was actually hit, and it had to be euthanized because it had a broken back. So that the road is really creating a barrier effect for them more than anything else. And then I think elk have, according to our data, it's showing that they want to move with the landscape. You see them in these like open meadows and sort of flatter terrain, especially if you go into like Maggie Valley or Cataloochee Valley. So I don't think they really like want to be on the ridge tops as much. They want to follow the gentle slopes of the land. And that's why they're not really climbing up the rugged topography of the double tunnel like the black bear are.
Super, thanks. So we're happy to try to answer any additional questions folks might have. It looks like maybe not a lot of questions are coming in right now. So I do want to thank Angela and Nikki for making this presentation. SAHC at any given time is working on 15 to 25 land acquisition transactions and conservation easements to help increase the connectivity of lands and help mitigate climate change in the ways that Angela was referring to at the beginning of the presentation. We have a very ambitious calendar of transaction closings ahead of us. And thank you for everyone who's joined this webinar. Looking at the list of folks who are participating, I see a lot of extremely generous and kind of consistent donors. And I hope that this presentation has helped you all feel a sense of optimism and somewhat empowered in this kind of climate crisis we're in. That's our aim, is to really try to help make a difference for the future. And it's really all of you who are helping us achieve that. So we're deeply grateful to all of you for the role you play with SAHC. We do have other webinars planned in this series coming up. I think there's one in November about our AmeriCorps program. So we hope that you'll join us for that. And am I missing a question that may have popped up? I think there's a question about momentum towards initiatives maybe in North Carolina that are analogous to what's being done in Florida.
That is an excellent question. Right now, we are definitely considering what's going on in Florida. Florida is very much a part of that Eastern Wildway concept that I talked about earlier. And one of our pillar initiatives of Wildlands Network is top carnivore conservation and the importance of carnivores on the landscape. So having these historic apex predators on the land is extremely important for ecosystem health. And as Florida develops this idea of wildlife corridor connectivity, we are very dialed in with what they're doing. And maybe one day you'll see a cougar in North Carolina again. But yes, great question. And thanks for keying into that.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you for presenting, and thanks to everybody who's joined us on the webinar. And we hope to see you down the road on the next Lunch and Learn webinar that we host. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you, SAHC, for all of your wonderful land conservation efforts in our area.
Likewise. Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks, Nikki.